In just 52 seconds, 47 vaccine doses would destroy 30 years of carefully constructed credibility. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. didn't expect the medical records. Senator Amy Klobuchar didn't expect him to have no defense. Cameras captured the moment his face drained of color. The Senate chamber fell silent as parents who had trusted him realized they had been deceived. What did the Minnesota senator reveal about Kennedy's own children that made the nation's most prominent vaccine skeptic look like everything he claimed to oppose? February 23, 2025, 9:47 in the morning. The Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee hearing room carried the weight of consequence that only confirmation hearings for cabinet positions can generate. This wasn't routine oversight or political theater. This was the moment when the United States Senate would decide whether to give the nation's most controversial medical activist control over the Department of Health and Human Services. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. entered the chamber with the confident bearing of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms and congressional hearings. At 71 years old, Kennedy moved with deliberate grace, his signature gravelly voice already resonating in pre-hearing conversations. His navy suit was immaculate, his leather briefcase containing prepared responses to questions he had anticipated for months. What Kennedy didn't know was that Senator Amy Klobuchar had obtained documents through legal channels that would expose the most devastating hypocrisy of his public career. Klobuchar sat 3 seats from the committee chairman, her expression neutral but her posture suggesting coiled energy. The Minnesota Democrat had prosecuted complex cases before entering politics, and her reputation for meticulous preparation had made her one of the Senate's most effective questioners. Behind her, 2 staffers guarded a manila folder marked with medical privacy waivers and court seals. Inside were documents that would change American healthcare politics forever. The hearing had already consumed 2 hours of testimony about Kennedy's environmental record, his legal victories against polluters, his advocacy for children with chronic diseases. Republican senators praised his commitment to reducing toxic exposures and questioning regulatory capture. Democratic senators expressed concern about his vaccine skepticism but acknowledged his passionate dedication to public health, even if they disagreed with his conclusions. Kennedy had performed well, his responses thoughtful and measured. He spoke eloquently about autism rates, chronic disease epidemics, and corporate influence over medical research. His voice carried genuine emotion when discussing sick children and families seeking answers that conventional medicine hadn't provided. Several senators who had entered the hearing skeptical of his nomination were visibly reconsidering their positions. But Senator Klobuchar hadn't asked a single question. She sat quietly reviewing documents while her colleagues exhausted their questioning time. Veteran congressional observers recognized the pattern. Klobuchar was waiting, preparing for something that required everyone else to finish first. At exactly 11:38, Chairman Bernie Sanders called on the Minnesota senator for her questioning period. "Mr. Kennedy," Klobuchar began, her voice carrying the measured precision of someone who had cross-examined hundreds of witnesses, "I want to start by acknowledging your long career advocating for environmental health and children's well-being." Kennedy nodded appreciatively, his shoulders relaxing slightly at what seemed like a respectful opening. "Senator, I've dedicated my life to protecting children from toxic exposures that our regulatory agencies have failed to address." "That's admirable," Klobuchar replied, her tone neutral. "You've been particularly vocal about vaccine safety concerns. You've written extensively about this issue, given hundreds of speeches, and built an organization dedicated to what you call vaccine risk awareness." Kennedy leaned forward, his activist instincts engaged. "Senator, I've never told anyone not to vaccinate. I simply advocate for informed consent, safer vaccine schedules, and honest acknowledgement of potential adverse effects that pharmaceutical companies and captured regulatory agencies refuse to discuss transparently." "You've never told anyone not to vaccinate," Klobuchar repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "But you have publicly stated that vaccines cause autism, despite overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary. You've compared vaccine mandates to the Holocaust. You've claimed that vaccine injuries are, quote, a Holocaust of enormous dimensions." Kennedy's jaw tightened. "Senator, I've used strong language to describe what I believe is a public health crisis being ignored by authorities who should be protecting our children." "Strong language indeed," Klobuchar said, opening her manila folder with deliberate precision. "Mr. Kennedy, how many children do you have?" Kennedy blinked at the unexpected question. "I have 6 children from 2 marriages." "6 children," Klobuchar confirmed. "And you've spoken publicly about your concerns regarding the CDC's childhood vaccination schedule, which currently recommends vaccines for mumps, measles, rubella, polio, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, hepatitis, rotavirus, pneumococcal disease, and several other conditions, correct? The specificity of her question created tension in the room. Kennedy responded carefully. Senator, I've questioned whether the current schedule has been adequately tested for safety when administered in combination, and whether the dramatic increase in vaccines since the 1980s correlates with the equally dramatic increase in childhood chronic disease. Klobuchar nodded slowly, as if acknowledging his answer while preparing to dismantle it completely. Mr. Kennedy, I have here medical records obtained through legal discovery in your 2010 divorce proceedings with Mary Richardson Kennedy. These records were filed under seal but became accessible through subsequent custody litigation. Kennedy's confident expression flickered. The mention of his late ex-wife and sealed court documents triggered visible discomfort. His hands, which had been resting casually on the witness table, now gripped the edge with increased tension. These records, Klobuchar continued, contain the complete vaccination history for all 6 of your children. Would you like to know what they show? The chamber fell into profound silence. Even senators who had been reviewing other documents looked up, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Senator, Kennedy began, his voice strained, my children's medical records are private and not relevant to my qualifications for this position. They're absolutely relevant, Klobuchar countered sharply, when you've built a career convincing other parents to reject vaccines while making different choices for your own family. She held up the first document, ensuring cameras could capture its official medical seal. According to these pediatric records, your eldest daughter Kathleen received her complete MMR vaccination series, measles, mumps, and rubella, the same vaccine you've publicly linked to autism. Kennedy's face had gone pale, but Klobuchar continued with prosecutorial momentum. Your daughter Kyra received the full DTaP series, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. Your son Connor received hepatitis B vaccines. Your son Aiden received the polio vaccine series. She placed each document deliberately on the table in front of her, building a visual representation of evidence that couldn't be denied. In fact, according to these comprehensive medical records, all 6 of your children received the complete CDC-recommended vaccination schedule that you've spent 30 years telling other parents is dangerous. Kennedy attempted to respond, but Klobuchar wasn't finished. Let me be specific about the numbers, Senator, because I think parents who trusted your advice deserve specificity. Your 6 children collectively received 47 vaccine doses across multiple disease categories. 47 doses, Mr. Kennedy. The exact schedule you've characterized as a toxic assault on children's immune systems. The number landed like a physical blow. 47 doses. Kennedy had built an entire movement around the claim that the modern vaccine schedule was excessive, untested, and dangerous. But his own children had received every recommended immunization. Senator, Kennedy finally managed, his voice barely audible. Those vaccination decisions were made years ago, in different contexts, with different information available. Different information, Klobuchar repeated with barely contained incredulity. Your first child was born in 1988, your youngest in 2000. You've been publicly opposing vaccines since the early 2000s. That means at least half of your children were vaccinated after you began your anti-vaccine advocacy. Kennedy had no response. The timeline made denial impossible. He had been warning other parents about vaccine dangers while ensuring his own children received those same vaccines. But Klobuchar had saved her most devastating evidence for this moment. Mr. Kennedy, let me read from a sworn deposition given by your late ex-wife Mary Richardson Kennedy in 2009 during custody proceedings. She pulled out a document that made Kennedy visibly recoil. Quote, Bobby insists that all the children received their scheduled vaccinations despite his public statements about vaccine risks. He has told me privately that his concerns are about regulatory oversight and corporate liability, not about the vaccines themselves being unsafe for our kids. He believes our children should be protected by vaccination but that the system needs reform. The words hung in the chamber like an indictment from beyond the grave. Kennedy's late ex-wife, speaking under oath, had directly contradicted everything he had been telling the American public for decades. Your own wife testified under penalty of perjury that you didn't believe vaccines were unsafe for children, Klobuchar said, her voice rising with controlled anger. You ensured your own children were fully vaccinated while building a movement that convinced countless parents to leave their children vulnerable to preventable diseases. Kennedy's face cycled through visible emotional states: shock, anger, defensiveness, resignation. Senator, my personal medical decisions for my family don't negate legitimate scientific questions about vaccine safety and regulatory capture. They absolutely negate your credibility, Klobuchar shot back. You can't claim vaccines are dangerous while vaccinating your own children. That's not advocacy, Mr. Kennedy. That's elite hypocrisy of the most harmful kind. The accusations silenced the room. Several Republican senators who had been supportive now looked deeply uncomfortable. The evidence wasn't about scientific disagreements or interpretation of studies. It was about fundamental honesty and whether Kennedy had been operating in good faith. Klobuchar pressed forward, sensing complete victory within reach. Let me share the consequences of your advocacy, Mr. Kennedy. She held up another document, this one from the CDC. In 2019, Rockland County, New York experienced the worst measles outbreak in decades. 312 confirmed cases. Why? Because vaccination rates in certain communities had dropped below 70% after your organization conducted educational campaigns in that exact area. Kennedy tried to interrupt, but Klobuchar's voice rose over his. 9 children were hospitalized. 2 developed encephalitis. 1 suffered permanent brain damage. All because parents trusted your message that vaccines were too risky, while you made certain your own children were protected. The human cost of his advocacy, presented with such specificity, was devastating. These weren't abstract policy debates or theoretical risks. These were real children who had suffered because their parents had followed advice that Kennedy himself hadn't followed for his own family. Senator Sanders, Klobuchar said, turning to the committee chairman, I have testimony from 3 parents whose children contracted measles in that Rockland County outbreak. With the chairman's permission, I'd like them to address Mr. Kennedy directly. Sanders nodded gravely, understanding that what was about to happen would likely end Kennedy's nomination. The first parent, Jennifer Martinez, approached a microphone set up in the hearing room. Her voice trembled but carried clearly through the chamber. Mr. Kennedy, my daughter Sophia was 6 months old during the Rockland outbreak, too young to be vaccinated. She relied on community immunity. She contracted measles from an unvaccinated toddler at a grocery store. Sophia spent 11 days in the hospital. She suffered seizures. She now has permanent hearing loss. Martinez paused, composing herself. I followed your advice, Mr. Kennedy. I joined your Children's Health Defense Facebook groups. I watched your videos. I convinced my sister not to vaccinate her children. And then I learned that your children were all vaccinated. How do you explain that? Kennedy sat frozen, unable to meet Martinez's eyes. Around the chamber, several senators were visibly moved. This wasn't political theater. This was accountability in its most human form. The second parent, David Chen, spoke with controlled fury. My son Marcus died, Mr. Kennedy. He was immunocompromised from leukemia treatment. He couldn't be vaccinated. He depended on everyone around him being vaccinated. But vaccination rates in our school district had dropped to 62%. 62%. Because parents believed your message that vaccines were dangerous. Marcus contracted measles at school. He died 6 weeks before his 8th birthday. Chen's voice broke, but he continued. Your children were protected by vaccines. My son is dead because other parents believed the lies you told while making different choices for your own family. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Kennedy's most ardent supporters in the hearing room looked shaken. The human cost of his advocacy had been presented with such devastating clarity that no political spin could minimize it. Klobuchar returned to her questioning, her voice now carrying the weight of undeniable moral authority. Mr. Kennedy, at 11:38 this morning, you told this committee that you've never told anyone not to vaccinate. But your organization's materials, your speeches, your books, all create fear about vaccines that leads parents to make choices you didn't make for your own children. You've called the vaccination schedule a Holocaust while ensuring your children received every dose. You've claimed vaccines cause autism while vaccinating all 6 of your children. You've built a 30-year career on medical skepticism that you didn't apply to your own family's healthcare. Kennedy finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Senator, I've always advocated for informed consent and vaccine safety improvements, not for eliminating vaccinations entirely. Then why are your children fully vaccinated according to the schedule you claim is dangerous? Klobuchar demanded. If you genuinely believed the risks you've spent 3 decades describing, wouldn't you have protected your own children from those risks? The question had no good answer. Either Kennedy had been lying about vaccine dangers, or he had knowingly exposed his own children to risks he considered serious. Neither option suggested someone who should be trusted with the nation's public health. At exactly 11:41, 52 seconds after Klobuchar had begun reading from Mary Kennedy's deposition, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s confirmation collapsed completely. Senator Collins from Maine stood and addressed the chairman. Based on the evidence presented today, I cannot support this nomination. A nominee who advocates policies for other families that he rejected for his own lacks the credibility necessary for this critical position. Within minutes, 3 more Republican senators made similar statements. The political calculation was complete. Kennedy's nomination was dead, killed not by scientific arguments about vaccine safety but by documentation of his own choices. The aftermath revealed patterns that extended far beyond one failed nomination. Investigative journalists discovered that Kennedy had received medical care for his children from top pediatricians who followed standard vaccination protocols, even as he promoted alternative practitioners who questioned vaccines. His children attended elite private schools that required full vaccination, while he fought against vaccine mandates for public school children. The class dynamics were inescapable. Kennedy had used his wealth and privilege to ensure his children received evidence-based medical care while convincing working-class parents to reject that same care. Within weeks, multiple civil lawsuits were filed by parents whose children had been harmed in disease outbreaks linked to areas where Kennedy's organization had been active. The legal theory was novel but compelling. Kennedy had created a public health crisis through advocacy he knew was misleading, as evidenced by his own family's medical choices. Perhaps most damaging was the reaction from Kennedy family members who had privately opposed his anti-vaccine activism for years. His sister Carrie Kennedy issued a public statement that captured the family's dismay. Bobby's exploitation of vaccine fears for personal influence and organizational fundraising, while protecting his own children through vaccination, represents a betrayal of the Kennedy legacy of science-based public service. Even Ted Kennedy championed healthcare access based on medical evidence, not conspiracy theories. The political implications were immediate and lasting. Kennedy's exposure didn't just end one nomination, it fundamentally changed how vaccine skepticism was perceived politically. What had seemed like brave truth-telling was revealed as cynical exploitation of parental anxiety. What had appeared to be medical freedom advocacy was exposed as elite hypocrisy. The movement Kennedy had built began fracturing as supporters realized their leader hadn't believed his own message enough to apply it to his family. Public health experts noted with grim satisfaction that vaccination rates began recovering in communities where Kennedy's influence had been strongest. Parents who had been convinced by his passionate speeches were reconsidering when they learned he had made different choices for his own children. The human psychology was simple and powerful. If vaccines were truly as dangerous as Kennedy claimed, why had he given his children 47 doses? The question answered itself. Medical researchers studying the anti-vaccine movement identified Kennedy's exposure as a turning point in public trust around immunization. For years, vaccine skeptics had successfully framed the debate as establishment medicine versus concerned parents. Kennedy's hypocrisy revealed a different dynamic, elite activists using working-class children as subjects in a natural experiment they wouldn't conduct on their own families. The class consciousness of vaccine politics shifted dramatically after Klobuchar's hearing. Sometimes the most effective accountability comes not from scientific arguments or policy debates but from simple documentation of personal choices that reveal what someone truly believes beneath their public advocacy. Senator Amy Klobuchar had done exactly that, presenting 52 seconds of evidence about Kennedy's own children that destroyed decades of carefully constructed credibility. Can advocates maintain moral authority when their private choices contradict their public recommendations? Should parents trust medical advice from someone who didn't follow that advice for his own family? Does privilege include the right to experiment on other people's children while protecting your own? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. learned these questions have answers that don't depend on scientific literacy or political ideology. The 47 vaccine doses his children received told a story that no amount of passionate speeches about vaccine dangers could rewrite. If this exposure revealed uncomfortable truths about medical advocacy and elite hypocrisy, consider how many other respected voices might operate under similar contradictions. Understanding what advocates actually do for their own families helps evaluate whether their public recommendations deserve trust. That principle applies whether the subject is vaccines, education, environmental policy, or any other area where personal choices reveal actual beliefs. Follow the behavior, not just the rhetoric. Kennedy had said trust your instincts about what's right for your children, never imagining that his own choices for his children would be used with such devastating effectiveness to expose what he actually believed about vaccine safety.